your snow day. I got about maybe 6 inches at my house, so it's awful nice outside right now. Check Georgia View for a written version of the announcement that I'm making right now. Your exam, your lecture exam, will be pushed back to the Thursday after spring break. I want to make sure you have time to ask questions in class on Tuesday, but I should finish the material for the exam in this video today. Your worksheet, your muscle contraction worksheet, is due in class on Tuesday. So here's where we left off. We have looked at what does it look like when we stimulate a single motor unit. So that means one nerve and all the muscle fibers it innervates, and we gave it one stimulus. We saw the latent period, or the lag time in between the stimulus and when the muscle started to contract. We saw a very quick contraction, but a much slower relaxation process. So now, what if we wanted to increase how frequently that muscle is contracting? So like how many times in a minute, for example, that muscle is contracting. So notice that's what's happening on this graph. We're giving multiple stimuli, those are our red arrows, and they're coming closer together in time. So what happens is the muscle doesn't have a chance to relax completely before it's stimulated again. Notice right here, this does not come all the way back down, right? It doesn't release all of the tension before it gets stimulated again. So we kind of get this little mountainside effect going on because the muscle isn't completely relaxed and then it gains even more tension. Now, this second one you really have to think about for a minute. The concentration of calcium in the cytosol increases. So remember, when a muscle is at rest, all that calcium has been pumped into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's being stored up. And when the action potential comes by, it gets released, can cause the muscle to contract by binding to troponin, and then the rest of it gets pumped back. Well, the problem is, if we're stimulating a muscle really rapidly, we don't have time to pump all that calcium back. So we start to see less calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and more calcium just kind of hanging out in the cytosol of the muscle cell. And we also start to get what's called summation. The stimulus has not gotten any bigger here, but the muscle contraction has. And that's because we're not letting the muscle relax completely before we stimulate it again. Now, if we increase the stimuli a lot, we have a really high frequency stimuli, we'll get something that looks like this, where the muscle contracts and we're stimulating it so much that it never has a chance to relax at all. And we refer to this as tetanus, and that just means sustained muscle contraction. Now, you do get a tetanus shot. That's a little bit different here. Here we're talking about sustained muscle contraction. And notice what happens. Even if this stimulus were to continue along the bottom, eventually the muscle would completely lose all of its tension. And we refer to that point as fatigue. The muscle just can't do it anymore. And usually that's because of this calcium situation here. You haven't had a chance to put any of your calcium back in the SR, and now there's just not any available to rush out when the action potential comes by, and the muscle just can't contract anymore. It's going to need a period of rest in order to put that calcium back before it's able to contract again. Now, if we want to increase how strong a contraction is, what we're going to do is we're going to start to involve more motor units. So 3 different pictures going on here. So on the first one, notice that we're giving 10 different stimuli, and they get bigger as we go. So stimulus 1 is a little tiny baby stimulus, and stimulus number 10 is a smack you in your face stimulus. Now, this first white dotted line represents the threshold stimulus. We have to reach a minimal level of stimulation by the nerve in order to tell the muscle to contract. If we're below that line, nothing's going to happen. But we also have a maximal stimulus where the muscle is not capable of responding anymore to that stimulus because it's doing everything that it can. So what you're looking at in the second graph here is just a cross-section of a muscle, and it's showing you different motor units, and as they become dark pink, it's showing you that they're involved in the contraction. And then on the bottom graph, it shows you the tension that is being gained in the muscle. And notice there is a maximum here. So let's look at this. We don't reach the threshold until stimulus number 3. So notice down here at stimulus 1 and 2, there's no motor units involved, there's no tension in the muscle, just because that's not enough stimulus to cause anything to happen. But as soon as we reach stimulus number 3, we start to get motor unit involvement, just a couple, and we start to gain a little bit of tension in our muscle. And as we increase the stimulus all the way up to number 7, we get more and more motor units involved, and we gain more and more tension in our muscle. But as soon as we hit that maximum stimulus, everything after 7, notice that we don't have any more motor units involved because there are no more motor units to be involved. And the muscle's at maximal contraction. Because all of the motor units are involved, there's no way to make that muscle contract anymore. So there is a minimum stimulus you have to have in order to get a muscle to contract, but there's also a maximal level at which no matter how much more you stimulate that muscle, it cannot respond anymore because it doesn't have any more motor units to get involved. So how does this process start? We call this process recruitment. This idea of let's start with a couple motor units, then we'll add a couple more, and we'll add a couple more until eventually we're our maximal contraction. So the way this is going to work is we're always going to start with our smallest muscle fibers being involved first. And then if all of them are involved and we still need more tension in the muscle, we'll recruit our medium muscle fibers. And then if we still need more, we'll recruit our largest muscle fibers. So think about this, right? You need to move some stuff, and so you do what most people do. You call up your friends who have trucks and you say, I'll give you a pizza and beer if you'll come help me move my stuff. Well, it's a really different situation if you just say, are getting a new sofa and need somebody to go to the store with you and move your sofa, right? You need one friend to help you move your sofa. But say you need to move every single thing you own and you have 2 hours to do it, right? You would have to recruit a lot more friends to help you do that, and you'd probably call some of the much stronger friends because you know you're going to have to move your washing machine and your bed and your refrigerator. So you're going to need a lot more brawn and a lot more strength. But eventually, you run out of people to call. And so once you've recruited everyone you can to help you, you're kind of at the maximum work that you can do in moving your stuff that day. So the question becomes, where does the energy come from in this whole muscle contraction scenario? So we mentioned this last time that ATP gets used for a couple of different things during muscle contraction and relaxation. So we did say it releases actin and myosin. That's what this move and detach cross bridges means. We have to have ATP to detach actin and myosin from each other. We also have to have ATP to run the calcium pump, to pump calcium back into, that should just say into, not out of, just into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And we're going to need that sodium-potassium pump to return sodium to the outside of the cell and potassium to the inside of the cell after an action potential has passed. Now, this is just in the muscle fiber itself. We did use some ATP back in the nerve. We had a calcium pump there as well, but we're just focusing on the muscle right now. Now, the problem I mentioned is our body cannot store very much ATP, about 2 to 3 seconds. But we can store the ingredients, oxygen and glucose, to make ATP. I said 2 to 3 seconds. I lied. It's 4 to 6 seconds. So if you can get anything done in 4 to 6 seconds, you can use stored ATP to do that. For some insane runner like Usain Bolt, who can run the 100-meter dash in like 6 seconds, he's pretty much just going to use his stored ATP for the process. but pretty much any activity that we undertake, even me sitting here making this lecture on my couch in my pajamas, I'm still waving my arms around just like I was in class, but my muscles are still using energy and they're having to make ATP as I go along this lecture, for the muscles in my arms as they flail, for the muscles in my neck that are holding up my head, for the muscles in my face and neck that are allowing me to talk. So the very first thing, say you just take off running, right? You're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, I don't know. You just take off running. For about the first 6 seconds, you'll use any stored ATP that's available. But like I said, most activities that we do are going to take longer than 6 seconds. So now we have to have some other avenues that we can use to make ATP. So the first method is what's called the creatine phosphate pathway. Now, what's really cool about this particular method is it doesn't require any oxygen at all. So it's really fast, right? You don't have to increase your oxygen availability for this to happen, but it's not very efficient. It only makes like 1 ATP at a time, which 1 ATP doesn't get you incredibly far. Creatine phosphate is something that we have hanging around in our body. It is stored in our body. And what happens in this reaction is creatine phosphate takes this P, the phosphate group, and adds it onto ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to make ATP, right? And the creatine phosphate, since it loses the phosphate, it's converted to creatine. Now, it does need an enzyme to help it do that. This enzyme is called creatine kinase. And the really cool thing about this is this reaction is reversible, which means if we are in a situation where we have some extra ATP hanging around, our body will do the reaction the opposite way. It will break ATP apart, stick the phosphate on the creatine to make creatine phosphate, and ADP. Now, creatine phosphate can be stored all day long. So this is a really great thing to do when we have some spare ATP, and it's a really fast way for us to get another little short burst of energy here. Now, it doesn't get us a ton of time. So at this point, we're gaining about 10 seconds worth of ATP. We had 4 to 6 from our stored. We get about 10 from the creatine phosphate pathway. If you're like me, 15 seconds still doesn't get you very far when you're running from anything. So we have to have some other mechanisms here. So our next method is called anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic glycolysis. Now, anaerobic tells us that this process still does not involve oxygen. We're going to need oxygen in a minute, right? The normal way that we make ATP involves oxygen. So what this process does is it takes glucose from our food and it converts it into 2 ATP. So for every 1 glucose is a 6-carbon sugar, it can make 2 ATP. So it's already better than the creatine phosphate pathway because it's basically making twice the amount of ATP that it did. Now, we're also going to talk about a method called aerobic cellular respiration. If you've taken intro biology, you've learned about cellular respiration. This is the main way that our cells make ATP. Anaerobic glycolysis is a lot faster than cellular respiration, but it is far less efficient in terms of the number of ATP that it's making. So if you notice right here, it only makes 2 ATP per glucose, and it's also producing lactic acid as waste product, and that lactic acid moves into the blood. And now it's one of those fun times I get to dispel a common human body myth. We are taught often that a buildup of lactic acid when we exercise is what causes our muscles to burn and what causes muscle soreness. And that's actually only partially correct. When you're exercising and your body's using this anaerobic pathway, you do build up some lactic acid. So it is responsible for the muscle burn you experience while you're exercising. However, the soreness that you feel maybe later that night or the next day, I did a Jillian Michaels last night, workout last night, and I'm definitely feeling some soreness today. That's actually referred to as delayed onset muscle soreness, DOMS. And that has nothing to do with lactic acid, because within about an hour of completing your workout, all that lactic acid has been disposed of. So what causes this delayed onset muscle soreness is actually micro tears in your muscle. And it's not a bad thing. These small tears in your muscle, your body works to repair, and that makes your muscle stronger. Which is why you hear some people argue when it comes to strength training to do less weight but more reps to make your muscles stronger. Now, this is going to get us a little bit more time. So now we have gained about 30 to 40 seconds of energy from our anaerobic pathway. So it's definitely better than the creatine phosphate. And that was definitely more ATP than what was stored. But we still, honestly, we can't complete like a minute's worth of exercise at this point. So if we're doing anything for longer than about 30 to 40 seconds, we're going to need a much more efficient means of generating ATP. That means is aerobic, which means needs oxygen, cellular respiration. And the way I keep this straight between aerobic and anaerobic is just remember when you do aerobics, you breathe really heavy, so you need a lot of oxygen. Now what this process does is it takes glucose from our food and oxygen that we've breathed in, and in the mitochondria, right, we always refer to that as the quote-unquote powerhouse of the cell. Here's why. This is where this cellular respiration process is going to happen. Now notice the difference here. For every 1 glucose you start with, you will make 32 ATP. Now, you may have read some books that say 28, 32. This is net ATP. You do use up a little ATP in the process, so it's basically 28 ATP that you can do something with. Water and carbon dioxide are released as waste. This is really what is running your body. It can provide hours of energy. 1 glucose gave you 32 ATP, right? There's millions of glucose molecules being used by your body every day. So this really is providing us the energy that we need. But again, it never really gets ahead. So you don't have a big stockpile, but you do have a stockpile of glucose in those glycogen granules and oxygen attached to the myoglobin in your muscle fibers. And we know that usually when you're exercising or doing some physical exertion, your respiratory rate will increase because you're having to bring in more oxygen to make more ATP. So here's what this looks like, right? We're going to go from stored ATP first to the creatine phosphate pathway next to anaerobic cellular respiration for a very short duration exercise, right? It would probably take me this long to run the 100-meter dash, to be honest, right? A very short burst of energy, right, that's less than about 45 seconds. You don't even need to use the oxygen pathways, right? You can use completely anaerobic pathways. But when you need more energy, right, and honestly, think about it. Walking from the tennis courts to People's Hall is going to be more than 45 seconds. So you're going to revert to this aerobic pathway of energy production. Now, I mentioned this idea of muscle fatigue before, and a really common misconception is the reason our muscles get fatigued, and when I say fatigued, I mean to the point, not just you're tired, but like they just cannot contract anymore at all. Some people think that that's actually because of running out of ATP, which is not true. Sometimes it can be nerve problems, which is kind of like a disease situation, but often it's this calcium issue. It's the issue of calcium could not get pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum fast enough, causing your muscles to be fatigued, or maybe you are just low on calcium in your blood, which has caused an issue there. So you're not ever going to run out of ATP until you die. So after you've exercised, just like when we talked about muscle contraction, we said there's always some cleanup work you have to do, right? You open the cabinet door, you better close it. So after we've exercised, our body goes through a couple of steps to return everything back to this pre-exercise condition. So the first one is we owe our body some oxygen, because when we start exercising and our body starts doing aerobic cellular respiration, the very first oxygen it's going to use up is that oxygen that's stored to your myoglobin, right? So it's going to use that up, and then it's going to start taking more oxygen out of your blood, because by that point you started breathing harder. So we owe our myoglobin some oxygen. We got to put that back. Any lactic acid that built up from the anaerobic glycolysis gets converted back to something else called pyruvic acid. This does not cause any muscle burn. This is why that burn, that during exercise burn, goes away relatively quickly, because the lactic acid gets converted back. We have to restore glycogen, right? Just like with the oxygen, we're going to tap into the stored glucose first. So we're going to start using those stored glycogen granules, and then if we require more glucose, we'll start getting some maybe out of our blood or from our liver. So we need to replace that stored glycogen. And then we're going to reform our little tiny amount of stored ATP, and if we do have any extra ATP, we can reform creatine phosphate. So basically we want everything to go back to the way it was before we started exercising. And if you think about it, this explains some things like why does my body continue to burn calories after I exercise? And why do I continue to breathe heavily after I exercise for a little while? It's because these processes are still going on to restore you back to your pre-exercise state. Now the oxygen one is really interesting. We call that the oxygen debt. And again, this graph is not the best at all, but what you're looking at here is how much oxygen you're breathing in. So obviously when you exercise, that volume increases, but it doesn't just immediately go back to normal, right? It doesn't just drop straight off here when you quit exercising. And again, I'm using this term exercise loosely. It does not necessarily mean a leotard and a workout DVD and jazzercise. Just walking across campus or walking from the parking lot is exercise. I know it feels a lot like it when you go up those stairs of Peoples. So what happens is our respiration rate goes down gradually, because this is where we're repaying that oxygen debt. We're bringing in more oxygen and we're attaching it to that myoglobin in our muscles to allow it to be ready for the next time that we need to tap into that oxygen store. Now, there's a lot of energy involved in these processes, right? Basically, chemical reactions are running our body, and a lot of that energy actually gets transformed to heat. If you remember way back in chapter 2, we said that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but it can change forms. So one of the ways that that happens is this chemical process. Some of that gets converted to the mechanical energy of our muscles contracting, but a lot of it actually gets released as heat. Now, here's a zombie, obviously no heat signature because it is The Walking Dead. Whereas a living human being, say you've done like some pull downs or bicep curls, you see those muscles have gotten very, very hot because they're releasing a lot of heat from these different processes. Now, there's a couple of different kinds of muscle fibers. Not all muscle fibers are created equal. So we can categorize them by their speed, fast and slow, as well as how they like to form ATP, either oxidative, which means it's going to involve oxygen, or glycolytic, which means it's not. There's a great table in your book, table 9.2. One thing I do want you to notice, there's slow oxidative, fast oxidative, and fast glycolytic. There is no such thing as a slow glycolytic fiber. So if you see that as an answer choice on an exam, you can automatically eliminate it because there is no such thing. Now, notice here, obviously slow versus fast. Really take a look at this and be able to compare these three different kinds of fibers relative to how they form ATP, how much myoglobin and glycogen they have, how quickly they're fatigued, and really the big difference in these is what kind of activity do we use them for. When we need a really fast but short burst of power, like hitting a baseball or swinging a golf club, we're going to use fast glycolytic fibers, right? They're using an anaerobic pathway, and they can make some ATP super fast. But if we want to do more prolonged activities, which you're doing right now because your head is being held up by your muscles, we're going to rely on slow oxidative fibers. So make sure you take the time to take a look at this table on page 303, study it up, know how to compare these different types of fibers to each other. Now, by itself, a muscle's pretty useless. Muscles have to have bones and joints in order to make the body do anything. And so we have to go back to this idea of leverage, right? Using a lever to move an object. Now, if you remember from about second grade, the way simple machines worked, here's a lever, right? We have a fulcrum right here. There's our lever, the aqua blue board. It's kind of like a seesaw. We have our load on one end, and we have our effort on the other, right? This is how I could lift a really heavy rock up, right, using just a board. It's a lever. I've got leverage. Now, there's a couple of different kinds of levers in the body, and just in the world in general. The first one is what's called a power lever. Now, the difference between these different kinds of levers is how the three parts of the lever are oriented. Remember, there's effort, there's the fulcrum, and there's the load. So a power lever, the fulcrum is really, really close to the load, and this lets you lift something really, really heavy with really minimal effort. So for example, this is how a car jack works. I can lift, sorry, that was an alarm going off. I can lift a really heavy car with really minimal effort, right? It's a power lever. It may not be fast, but I can accomplish a lot of power with that type of lever. On the other hand, we have a speed lever. Now notice that the whole thing is completely oriented differently now. We still have our load on the end, but our effort and our fulcrum have swapped places. So this would be like using a shovel, right? The load is what's on the shovel. The effort is your arm in the middle of the shovel, and then the fulcrum is your arm on the end of the shovel. Now, the problem here is, here's the load, 50 kilograms, and it requires 100 kilograms of effort. And if you've ever spent a day shoveling anything, you are completely aware of how much effort that takes. So this does take quite a bit of effort, but it can be done very, very quickly. So the body is just kind of a combination of different kinds of levers. Now in the body, we can classify these as first, second, and third class levers. And again, using our kind of basic model of a lever up here, we show what the difference is. First class is the traditional kind of lever that you learn about. Load on one end, effort on another, fulcrum in the middle. So this, for example, is what allows you to nod your head back and forth, right? The load being the weight of your head, the effort being provided by your neck muscles, and the fulcrum being the atlanto-occipital joint, basically where your spine meets your skull. And I bet you're all sitting there nodding your head right now, as am I. So a second class lever has rearranged things. Now the fulcrum's on the end, the load's in the middle, and the effort's on the other end. So this is like using a wheelbarrow. A good example here is when you stand on your tiptoes. So the fulcrum would be the joint right there between your phalanges and your metatarsals. The load is the weight of your body kind of pulling down, gravity and the weight of your body. And then the effort is being provided by your gastrocnemius, which is your calf muscle. And then the last class of lever, really similar to second class, but we flip-flop the load and the effort. Now the load's on the end, the effort's in the middle, and the fulcrum's on the other end. So this would be what we use when we're doing a bicep curl. And that sounds really strange. Obviously the load is the weight in our hand, and our fulcrum is our elbow. But it seems kind of weird because we say that the effort is being provided by our bicep. So how on earth is that in between the load and the fulcrum? And the important part to remember is that this bicep muscle is attached down here in your forearm. And so the effort is in between the load and the fulcrum. So just take some time to get familiar with those different kinds of levers and really, how do they differ, right? If I gave you, a drawing of load, fulcrum, and effort, you could tell me what kind of lever that was. Now, I'm really quickly going to talk about smooth muscle. We're not going to talk about cardiac muscle in this chapter because it gets its own entire chapter and then some in Anatomy 2, but I want to talk very briefly about smooth muscle. We know that we find it in hollow organs, so things like your stomach, your intestines, your uterus, your bladder, lots of smooth muscle. It looks a lot like epithelial tissue to me. It does have a fine layer of connective tissue kind of over the top of it. Now the really cool thing, smooth muscle can do something called peristalsis. What you're looking at here is a cross section of the intestinal tract. And what you'll notice is there's actually 2 layers of smooth muscle involved here. So we have a circular layer of smooth muscle, so its fibers are going around in a circle. And then on top of that, we have a longitudinal layer of smooth muscle, and its fibers are going long ways. Now together, these smooth muscle fibers can move food or semi-digested food through your small intestine. And the way they do that is when the circular layer of smooth muscle contracts, it's going to make the intestine smaller in diameter, right? It's going to kind of squeeze and make it smaller in diameter. When the longitudinal muscle contracts, it's going to make the opening or the lumen of the intestine bigger in diameter. So by contracting in an alternating fashion, you're making the tube of the intestines bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller. And essentially you're squeezing the contents down through the intestine. And this kind of works in like a wave-like pattern to move stuff through your intestines. It's actually really cool. Now, smooth muscle is quite a bit different than skeletal muscle. We talked about things like striations and the number of nuclei and all that good stuff, but there's some other differences here as well. So one is the neuromuscular junction, where the nerve communicates with the muscle. So we said in skeletal muscle that was this synapse type setup where we had one motor neuron about halfway down the length of the muscle fiber communicating with that muscle fiber. Now, instead, we have autonomic nerve fibers because remember, smooth muscle is involuntary, whereas skeletal was voluntary. And instead of just having like one synapse, and one axon terminal, we now have these little bulging areas on the end of the nerve called varicosities, this word right here. And each one of these varicosities is capable of releasing neurotransmitters to communicate with that smooth muscle. Now, part of the reason that there are so many of them is the synapse is a lot bigger between this nerve and smooth muscle than it was between a motor neuron and skeletal muscle. And because the gap is a lot bigger, we release a lot more neurotransmitter to make sure that we get some that makes it across the gap. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole process of smooth muscle contraction. A couple of things I do want to point out is the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it does exist, but it's pretty pathetic. So calcium is needed for smooth muscle to contract, but rather than that coming out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, most of that is going to come from outside of the smooth muscle cell, just from out in the extracellular fluid. There's no T-tubules involved here, right? Remember, those took action potentials deep into the skeletal muscle fiber. And again, most of the calcium is going to come from outside of the cell in order to cause that muscle contraction. Now, we do still have actin and myosin involved, but there's a lot fewer myosin filaments than there are in skeletal muscle. So in skeletal muscle, it's about 1 to 2 ratio in terms of actin or myosin to actin. In smooth muscle, it's a 1 to 13 ratio. So your actin greatly outnumbers your myosin in smooth muscle. This really would make such a great compare and contrast question, smooth versus skeletal muscle. Now, what controls smooth muscle contraction can also differ a little bit. Now, obviously, a nerve can control it, and smooth muscles rely on a lot of different neurotransmitters. Skeletal muscle relied on acetylcholine, but smooth muscle can use lots and lots of different neurotransmitters, and the crazy thing is, one neurotransmitter can cause one thing to happen, a different neurotransmitter can cause a different thing to happen. We're going to talk about this a lot when we get to the nervous system. Now, hormones can also cause smooth muscle to contract because some smooth muscles don't have a nerve supply at all, and they're either going to depolarize spontaneously, which skeletal muscle cannot do, or they're going to respond to some sort of chemical stimuli, whether that is hormones or the level of some other substance in the blood. Now, here's a really good example of why we should be grateful for our smooth muscle. Typically, stretching promotes contraction, but smooth muscle adapts to its new length. You stretch it, it relaxes. You stretch it, it relaxes. You stretch it, it relaxes. And this is pretty important because this is why as soon as urine fills our bladder, just a tiny bit, we don't have to go to the bathroom. Right? Our bladder can continue to stretch to a point where it then sends a message to your brain, hey, you really need to go to the bathroom. The same thing with the uterus, right? That baby grows and grows and grows, and that uterus stretches and stretches and stretches, but it's not till it reaches a certain level of stretchiness does it induce labor, because the baby has to have long enough to develop. Now, there's two kinds of smooth muscle. The kind we've really been talking about in the walls of our hollow organs is called unitary smooth muscle. It can depolarize through any of those ways that we talked about. The other kind is called multi-unit smooth muscles. This is where we see a lot of constriction and dilation, right? Places like your arteries, your bronchi, your pupils. It's a little bit different than the rest of the smooth muscle because it's operating very independently of everything else in the body. So that's all I have for this one. That is the end of chapter 9. So you now have all of the material you need to study for your next test, but that test has been pushed back to the Thursday after spring break. Your muscle worksheet is due in class on Tuesday, and you do have top hat questions that have to be completed by Saturday, so please double check that.